Thank you, Dan, and I want to thank all of the Extension staff for providing technical support for this meeting. My name is Matt Kruger. I'm the Executive Director of Wisconsin Land and Water, and on behalf of the Wisconsin Land and Water Board of Directors and staff, I want to welcome you to day 2 of our virtual county conservation meeting. I'm very excited about the conversation we're about to have on the topic of racial equity and inclusion. As we all know, this is an extremely timely conversation and one that's playing out on a worldwide scale in our local communities as well, due to recent events, most notably the death of George Floyd. This is a discussion that's occurring more and more frequently in conservation circles, though I think it's safe to say hasn't traditionally occurred that frequently. And to my knowledge, it's the first time such a conversation is occurring within our organization. While we don't have actual demographic information on the racial makeup of Wisconsin Land and Water's membership, I can say anecdotally that it's dominantly white. Given that, it might be easy for us to think that this isn't really a front and center issue in need of our attention, like so many of the other pressing issues are that we deal with. But I don't think that's a correct assumption that we can make. The issue is one that does need our attention, and it might take some work on our part to recognize that, but it's there. As we've been recently discussing as an organization, what our specific role is to meaningfully engage on this topic, I've actually heard directly from members about the ways this issue is impacting them in pretty explicit ways. So this conversation is very timely, and I look forward to learning from it. Before I announce our speakers, I want to note that we don't have a final closing session this morning. The meeting will end when the sessions wrap up around 11:35. So as such, I just want to take the opportunity now to thank all of you for participating, for trying something new, and for having patience with us as we navigate a virtual county conservation meeting for the first time. And we'd love you to share your thoughts about the experience via a survey that we'll send you after the meeting. Okay, so now on to our speakers in our session. I'm very pleased to welcome Ananda, Mirilli, and Jordan Bingham, directors from the NINA Collective, a consulting collective that partners with organizations on systems change initiatives so they can advance racial equity within their own organization and field. I'll invite Ananda and Jordan to give a more in-depth introduction to themselves after they unmute themselves and activate their webcams, which I see they've already done, and share their presentation screen. As Dan said, there'll be a chance to submit questions, which will be done exclusively by using the chat box. So when the presentation's finished, we'll select questions in the order that they're received, and we'll try to get through as many as we have time for, but probably not all of them. So Ananda and Jordan, the floor is yours. Please take it away.
Good morning, everyone. Bon dia. My name is Ananda. Pronouns she, hers. I just put it in a chat. If you can join me in introducing yourselves, sharing your preferred pronoun, and which organization that you're tuning in from, it'll be great. I'm gonna put my presentation here up for us. I'm gonna take just a few moments just to introduce our collective. We are a collective of consultants that are doing racial equity work, racial justice work, and we have done this individually for quite some time. And over the last couple years, we got together to talk about what does it look like to create a collective of consultants that operate in a structure that it's parallel to current structures that we see around. So we created a cooperative, and so that's how we operate. A little bit about our mission. We really understand that we really need to tap into something different and different ways to do things and to operate in all aspects of our systems. And one way that we can offer to our community and to folks all over Wisconsin is through modeling. That, you know, it is possible to have transformation. It is possible to create sustainable and supportive communities. It is possible to create a new system and new structures that are built in racial equity. Here's the 4 approaches in which we tackle this really important mission. We believe that, you know, we really needed to deconstruct both our ways of thinking, our ways in which we have been taught certain aspects of our history and ways in which we relate to each other. We also talk a lot about decolonize. What does that mean to start talking about our land and our water in ways in which we pay homage to the body of natural resources that were in the care of Indigenous people. And we very much believe in collaboration. That is the root of our work. And very important, having spaces and open space to co-create.
Thanks, Ananda. My name's Jordan Bingham, and I'm a partner of Ananda's and the other directors at the Nina Collective, and pronouns she, her, hers. And we'll just give you a little bit about my background and kind of what brought me to this work. As a white person who was raised in rural Indiana, it's been a journey for me of learning and lifelong learning for sure. My formal training and most of my professional experiences in the field of public health. I worked in government public health for about a decade in state and local government. And so, got a chance to really understand how government works and interfaces and does not, create systems that work for everyone. And that's really where I came to the work of racial equity. And I'm really fortunate and grateful for that. And what we want to do right now is first acknowledge where we are here in Wisconsin. And I know there are folks from all over the state joining us today, and we want to acknowledge the land first that we are on, and just acknowledging and affirming that we're on the land, the traditional land of Indigenous people. You can see on the map that Wisconsin has 11 federally recognized nations, in addition to the Brothertown Indian Nation, which has been fighting to acquire federal recognition for almost 200 years. And we just want to honor, before we get started with our part of the day, with gratitude, the land itself and the people who have stewarded it throughout generations. We are here Ananda and I are both in Madison, so we're on Ho-Chunk land. So if you want to just take a moment to look at the map and see kind of where you are and on what land you're standing. And Ananda, whenever you're ready to move to the next slide. Oh, can I do it? No, you can do it. Okay. So you are here today for a conversation on racial equity and inclusion. We are thrilled to see the number of people in this conversation. As Matt said, this is something that I think that's been on all of our minds, maybe more than ever, is certainly in the news and just in the daily consciousness and dialogue. And so we're thrilled that you joined us today, and thank you for being here. And just want to acknowledge that, you may have some questions, you may have some things you're wondering about, some things you want to learn more about, or some things that you feel unsure about. So I would ask for you all to use the chat right now to share something that's on your mind, whether it's something that you want to learn more about, a question that you have, something that you're hoping to explore more personally or professionally with regard to racial equity and inclusion. So go ahead and use the chat to type in just a thought or a question that's on your mind right now. Thank you. What can I do as a white woman to help people of color gain equity in our society? I know I've had a lot of conversations along those lines with other white people. What can I do? What is my role? How can I do more? How our rural county can examine our practices and policies and find ways to be better as an institution and as individuals. How do we get youth with diverse backgrounds interested in careers in conservation? Thank you. These are great questions. Thinking about expanding and diversifying our workforce. Keep those coming. I would love for you all to just keep sharing those, and we'll come back to some of these. And I would encourage you all to read these and look for commonalities or questions that might challenge you as well. How to raise white boys to be aware of their privilege. That's welcome to my world. I have one of those as well. I want to learn how a predominantly white family farm organization can encourage racial equity and inclusion in agriculture. Thank you so much. What we won't have time for today is to go deeply into the history, and some of you may know some of this as well or better than we do of land and land use and how racism and discrimination has you know, kept people of color from owning land and being successful in farming, not just in Wisconsin, but across the country. So we can share some resources for you to learn more about that too. Where's a good place to start on the topic? Many of our rural communities, that aren't that diverse. It's a question that we grapple with a lot. We were just yesterday with a statewide group of public health community-based organizations working with public health systems and across Wisconsin. And there is this question of, you know, is there, you know, how do you balance this idea of urban, rural, when you look at the entire state of Wisconsin? And we had some really great questions about just, you know, what Wisconsin looks like, how it's organized racially, and, you know, the fact that there are communities of color in every county in Wisconsin. They just often aren't seen or necessarily deeply involved in community life in the way that you know that white folks are. And so we'll just scratch the surface today, but would love to work with you more on some of these questions. Go ahead to the next one, Ananda. What we will do today, these are our learning objectives, is we want to start with a shared understanding of some common terms related to diversity, equity, and inclusion, and explore their significance for all of you in the work of conservation, acknowledging the very present and very current context of inequities and calls for racial justice. And then think about a call to action. How can you take from today, move into deeper learning and action for yourself, your family, your community, and also your organization. But we really do think it's important to start with kind of normalizing the conversation and just being able to talk about these things and using the same words. You know, we don't have to agree on everything, certainly, but using sort of the same words and the same definitions for what we're talking about. Go ahead.
Thank you so much, Jordan. I had shared with Matt and some other folks around my introduction to the work of organizing, the work of justice in this country. I'm originally from Brazil. I moved here, I was 21 years old. And the introduction that I had was global warming, you know, the threat of global warming. And I was a student at Madison College way back in the day. And at that time, we were fighting for recycle bins and, you know, multiple ways of recycling. And that was, we had a green club. It was like the first green club of the college. And when, you know, issues of race and ethnicity started becoming, or immigration issues started coming to the surface and potentially more salient for me, what I noticed was that people wanted to divide the conversation. Either you talk about sustainable practices or conservation or climate, global warming or climate control, and then, oh, you want to talk about race and ethnicity. That is a different conversation, right? And what I noticed that my group over here that were, you know, we're protesting, we're sending letters, we're not very interested in having the conversation or doing the same advocacy work for people from racially diverse backgrounds or even immigration rights. And it was a really interesting introduction to the US culture, which we tended to see those things, see those issues as completely separate issues, right? And I think that I'm sure there's many of you in a call that understand environmental justice and how that actually disproportionately impact people of color and Black people and brown people and indigenous people to a much greater degree. So we, one of the terms that we wanted to introduce, and maybe some of you already have seen some of the reporting around this, is this triple pandemic. I remember very early on, people started making connections to what was happening with COVID, which is a pandemic that everyone knows about, right? Like there's no one person that doesn't know, what is COVID or what's happening with COVID right now. and have an opinion about. And we may not agree with our opinion, but at least have a form opinion about what's happening with COVID. What was underlining the pandemic and when COVID came, the much older pandemic, what's called racism, institutional racism, that has been very much part of our history for over 400 years, became even more salient with COVID. We started seeing racial disparities all over the country, and in particular in the state of Wisconsin. We are either number 1 or number 2 as far as racial disproportionality in regards to the impact of COVID. So those are the 2 things that became very salient to people like myself and Jordan that are doing racial justice work, have been doing racial justice work for a while. And then, attached to those things were also this pandemic around what is happening with what is happening and what will happen to the economic structure that we have created. So we're also in this imminent of an economic crisis. Now, this economic crisis is going to be extremely intertwined with COVID and also issues around race. And so people are start having some of those conversations now in a much more in spaces much more mainstream than before, and trying to even figure out what's the terminology around talking about the multiple impacts of COVID in a more expensive way. But what we know is that Black, Brown, and Indigenous people are likely to be your, essential workers. They're likely to be working in jobs where they cannot work from home. They cannot use Zoom. And so maybe many of us are like, oh yeah, it's an inconvenience, but I get to work from home. But for a lot of folks, that is not true. And I think we may have seen also reports around renters, and also folks that are experiencing some sort of economic distress, not being able to pay rent because now their work is limited, or they lost their hours of work. And then they have less access to capital to support that. We start seeing disproportionality all over the system, and that's becoming much more salient than what I think most people realize to be true. So there's been some greater reports around what is happening, what's the impact current on COVID, what is expected. So I wanted to offer this as an entry point to our conversation around what is happening in our society currently, and how this conversation has become our everyday conversation with our friends, with our colleagues, in our communities, and often divorced from the people that are experiencing the greatest impact. Jordan?
Thanks, Ananda. So we just want to be really clear that racial inequity is not natural, it's not normal, and at the same time, it has happened by design. Oftentimes we hear people say the system's broken, or things aren't working the way they're supposed to. Our position really is that things are working exactly the way they were designed, and that these things have happened over generations to give us the outcomes that we have now. I had a conversation with my mom recently, who's in her 70s and who witnessed the civil rights movement of the 1960s and felt like it was such a time of change and rebirth, and it was. And I think that as a middle-class white woman, thought, okay, great, let's move on. And to have a conversation with her about how these things are still perpetuating, and that in many cases racial inequity and those gaps are bigger than they ever have been, is hard to hear. And yet, we sort of understand what these things are rooted in. So we've just included a few examples of, how did we get here? On the left, you see the interstate highway system, which across the country, cut in half many communities of color that were thriving. with the promise of urban renewal, that was never really fulfilled. Up on the upper right, you see a redlining map, which happened in medium to large size cities all over the country, which actually divided cities into what were considered to be a desirable or undesirable place to live, and had to do with who could get financing for housing, and that legacy lives today in our the segregation that we see across the country. The picture that you see there with some Black elders walking, that was a protest in 2002 around financing for farm loans, which have been deeply, deeply unfair, disproportionately over generations. If you're interested in learning more about that, we encourage you to check out the 1619 Project, which talks it's both a written series and also a podcast series. And there's one episode that talks specifically about land and agriculture, and how Black families have systematically been stripped of land ownership. The school to prison pipeline, which, as you can see, is the disproportionality in how school discipline policies can lead to our very, very inequitable representation of Black and brown people in our carceral system. And then lastly, who gets to protest and who gets to be protected in protest. And so, all of these things, just to remind us that things are by design, and that inequity didn't happen by accident. And then the quote, "There is no room for neutrality once we're clear on how rigged the system is." So now that you're here, and now that you know this, it's incumbent on all of us to keep learning and continue to act. Go ahead, Ananda.
This session is an overview, really briefly, about some of the things that we wanted to offer you all as an introduction. Of course, this conversation is much more expensive than the time that we have this morning. And we understand that people in this call are coming, there's 80 some people in this call are coming into this conversation with all sort of background, experiences, understanding, and then vocabulary, which sometimes can be a hindrance to how we are talking about it. So someone I think Matt shared, like, where is the starting point? Like, where do we start? So like understanding like how to communicate, what is a vocabulary, what is a terminology, and what those terminology means. It's extremely important. So I'm gonna transition us into a video. So I'm gonna stop this, the session here real quick. And then what we're gonna do with this video, you're gonna see us a story of us talking about different things that has happened to us. And then towards the end, there's some reflection questions. We're not gonna have time to go through all of them, but I see the chat is a little silent, and which I'm thinking that you all are like taking copious notes of everything, or really trying to focus and understanding, on the content. And I really appreciate that, but we really encourage you to, do some of that processing, on a chat too, so we know what's happening. And always too, we welcome folks that have dissenting views around what we're talking about. So if for some reason things are rubbing you in a particular way, and it's like, I don't know about this, please let us know, so we can get into a conversation about understanding why do we have sometimes different perspectives, and how we can unpack those different perspectives. So if you're ready for our video.
Diversity is the wide range of national, ethnic, racial, and other backgrounds of U.S. residents and immigrants as social groupings coexisting in U.S. culture. The term is often used to include aspects of race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, class, nationality, and much more. Cultural competence is a process of learning about other cultures, thereby broadening our own understanding and ability to participate in a multicultural process. The key element to becoming more culturally competent is respect for the ways that others live in and organize the world, and an openness to learn from them. cultural humility is a framework for moving us towards equity and justice that incorporates a consistent commitment to learning and self-reflection, an intentional investment in mutually beneficial relationships, and the facilitation of healing-centered engagement while recognizing and redressing the role of power and privilege in a system. The goal is to build understanding of self and personal culture to improve competence. Coming from a background in public health and health services, I entered the field like a lot of people, with a naive desire to help people live healthier lives. I thought education was the key and didn't fully understand the ways in which structural racism and exclusion make it much harder for people and communities to be healthy. Cultural competency has been a common approach in public health for decades. It focuses on learning about and understanding other cultures to better serve them. Unfortunately, this approach can have the impact of maintaining stereotypes and continuing to disempower marginalized people. This can be especially problematic since the public health profession has been comprised largely of white women, often serving communities of color, refugees and immigrants, and people living in poverty. I can remember very well-intentioned colleagues in public health working in programs like WIC, or the Women, Infants, and Children program, saying things like, "These young moms come from poverty, so they've never learned to manage money, and that's why they spend money on frivolous things." Instead of understanding the structural reasons why moms might need assistance in the first place, we were jumping to conclusions about their situations. Cultural humility, on the other hand, works in the belief that people and communities have the answers and the solutions to their own lives. In my most recent experience in public health, I witnessed my colleagues investing their professional development time to participate in African American history courses, learning about the racial history of our community, hiring people from impacted communities, and working at the policy level to address some of the reasons women and families were food insecure in the first place.
So here's some of the prompts that we want you all to think about. Where's the story? Where in the story did you hear about diversity, about cultural competence, and about cultural humility? And then can you start to think of a story that you have experienced that are related to those terms? I'm gonna give you all like a few seconds, and I'm gonna start another video just because we're short on time, but please add in a chat what's your reaction to the video. Okay, you all ready for another video?
Racism equals race-based prejudice plus power, for example, economic or social power. It can be conscious or unconscious and occurs at the individual, institutional, and structural levels. Implicit or unconscious bias. Thoughts and feelings are implicit if we are unaware of them or when we don't know their nature. We have a bias when, rather than being neutral, we have a preference for or aversion to a person or group of people. Thus, we use the term implicit bias to describe when we have attitudes towards people or associate stereotypes with them without our conscious knowledge. Microaggression refers to the slights, put-downs, and invalidating remarks that traditionally marginalized group members experience every day when interacting with people who unknowingly engage in implicit or unconscious bias. When I was an undergrad, I took every opportunity on campus to assist in paying for college. One of those opportunities was to serve as a class note-taker. In this one class, I asked the professor if she needed a note-taker. She said she wasn't sure yet. I asked if anyone else had signed up, and she responded no, so I let her know I was interested. At the end of the class, she turned to my classmates and asked if anyone was interested in taking notes for the class. I raised my hand, but she waited for others. Another student raised her hand, wanting to know more information about it, and the professor explained to the student what it meant to be a note-taker. The student said she was going to think about it and get back to the professor. I was surprised when the professor began to convince the other student to consider. I left the classroom wondering, why was this happening to me? The following class, I shared with the professor that I have been a note taker in other classes before, and that I was trying to understand why the process was different in this class. She then turned to me and said that she wanted to make sure that everyone was given a chance to be a note taker, and she wanted to choose the best note taker. She met with my classmate and I, and she asked to see our notes at the end of the class so she could decide who was going to be the official note taker. I again told her this has never happened before, to which she replied, "How else would I know your notes are good?" I left the class confused and with a heavy heart. I missed the following class due to my daughter being sick. When I emailed the teacher asking to be excused for that class, she replied by stating that the other student was going to be the official note taker since my attendance was not reliable. By that time, I realized that something else was going on. I had a chance to talk to a counselor who confirmed that the professor's approach was not aligned with the standard protocol. I wonder why the professor was doubting my note-taking skills. I wondered the extent to which my race, the tone of my skin, and my accent informed the professor's actions. I wonder if she had a bias about immigrants or people from whom English is not their native language. I wonder if it's none of those things. But the uneasy feeling never left my heart, and it culminated with me filing for a formal complaint and request for a class change.
Here's the prompt for this second story. What role did racism play in the story? How did you see unconscious or implicit bias play out in the story? And then what are some of the examples of microaggressions that you noticed? Can you think of a story on your own related to any of both videos? So stop here, this video, to a presentation. And at this point, I'm gonna do the following. I'm gonna stop sharing. And then what I wanted to invite everyone is to, if you can, turn your cameras on because we have a few minutes. And then I really would love to have a couple volunteers. Thank you, Michelle. Thanks, Matt. Thanks, Patricia. To either respond to anything that they've seen in the video. What's coming up for you? What are some of the things that you do as you're watching the videos and thinking about the prompts on the presentation? And whenever you're ready, you can unmute your phone. Oh, it's great to see so many people. And you were all there, just couldn't see you.
Ananda, I can start just to get us going. Actually, just last night, I live in downtown Madison, and there's often people around my house, and I observed some people parked in a car. There was a car idling outside of my house that had been idling there for a while, and as I came out there, I noticed it had been idling for a while because I could smell kind of the fumes in my house, and I noticed a person got out of the car, another person that car drove away that they had been sitting in, and then they got into another car, and that car drove away, and I thought, I didn't know what was going on there, but I thought my first thought was drug deal. I'll say I'm pretty confident I've seen those things before, but the men happened to be black. And I caught myself and I said to my wife, here I am observing this. I don't know if it's my bias that their race. I'm white, they're black. I don't know how much that's playing in, but I'm sure it's a factor. And I kind of tried to go through, had they been white, would I have thought the same thing? And so we talked about it for a while, but I mean, the issue of implicit bias was very, very explicit for me right then and there last night, thinking about that. That's what that makes me think of.
Thank you, Matt. Thanks for being courageous and being the first one to share. And yeah, self-awareness, it's a big part of doing this work. Maybe one more volunteer. I see there's people squirming to unmute their button. I'm gonna.
can go.
Oh, yay!
Sorry.
I saw you squirming. I knew you were going to. Go ahead.
Okay. Hi, everybody. This story, I think the thing that caught my attention was that the teacher was hiding behind fairness to hide their own bias. And then didn't even try to understand the student's background, why didn't attend that class, and just, you know, set it aside as, okay, you're not reliable, and I'm sorry you had to go through that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, thank you for saying that. And two things, I'll start with the last thing first, just to say that I knew one day I was going to get paid to share those stories. So I feel okay that I'm in a learning space and there's an exchange to that. But so many people, this happens so often, right? To so many people, and then they never find a way to reconcile with that. Second thing is the first thing you said, which is like how many times we see in our systems or even with ourselves when we talk about fairness, right? We say, but this is, yes, it makes sense that, this is, makes sense that like, yeah, people lost their job because that's the job that they chose, right? Or this is the neighborhood that they chose to live. We create stories in our mind, and we have been creating stories for over 400 years around how people get to live, and we call them choices. And if we start investigating more of the history, both of the history in Wisconsin and the history of our country, is that we begin to learn that there were no choices. Like people were put in particular places, or were giving particular opportunities or not giving particular opportunities, or had to navigate particular structures that were differently set up for them in order for to see where we have now. People of color are living in mostly divested neighborhoods, people of color and indigenous people not having access to land. And I'll say one more thing, and I want to open to Jordan for a couple more minutes that we have. Someone mentioned agriculture, and it was really interesting because I've been I've moved to different countries, and I always like to investigate things and whatnot. I'm a very curious person. What I find really interesting is that agriculture in the U.S. is a proxy of whiteness, right? It's mostly white people or white families. That is not the case in most of the world. Indigenous people, Black and brown people, our roots is in agriculture. Like most of us have, our third generation, where our families were, that's how they find their livelihood. That's how they provided for their families. So, that's another way we can start decolonizing the way in which we talk about things and try to understand why the structures are the way they are currently. Jordan, what would you say?
Really appreciating the conversation, and would love to hear from more of you in the few minutes we have left. Someone was sharing a resource in the chat and asking if we had others that we recommend, and I froze for a second because I was like, oh my gosh, we have so many things to recommend, and where do we start? Sort of to Matt's question at the beginning, but so the thing that thank you, Michelle, for sharing the implicit Project Implicit. If you've ever heard of it, the implicit bias or implicit association test, it's a site that is run by Harvard University that allows people to explore where their implicit biases might be. And there are many different types of tests that you can take related to race, ethnicity, gender, profession, ability, disability, and many more. So we always encourage people to explore that, and just with the reminder that your results are your own. They can be private to you. You don't have to, it's not to make you feel a certain way. It's for you to understand where you are today, because the good news about all this is that it can change and improve. And I can tell you that firsthand. The other thing that we recommend is excuse me, the Race, the Power of an Illusion series. And it's actually, I think it's over 15 years old at this point. It's a documentary series done by, excuse me, PBS and the California Newsreel that does a really good job of digging into the construction of race in this country and how whiteness was created and has changed over time and has even been confirmed by Supreme Court decisions to define who is and is not white in this country, and how that has structured advantage and power and wealth in this country. It's a 3-part series, and then on the website, many other learning resources. And I think it's a really great place to start. Wondering if folks have other questions in the few minutes we have left.
I think we are on our time.
Oh,
so,
yeah.
And I've been sharing all the things that you said, all those resources on the chat. One last thing that is in the chat is one word, which, folks can put on the chat, one word of next step that they have in mind. And then the other thing is a really short Google form if people want to connect with us or get more information or subscribe to our newsletter. Please complete. There's a bit.ly link that I just put it again in there that folks can engage and fill it out. We'll receive that information.
Oh, Ananda, you may need to change the permission
Oh,
to let people get in, but that's a quick.
Yes, I'll do that while we're.
Yeah,
we can send it out as well later too.
Oh, thanks, Christina.
All of these resources.
Yeah. Yeah, in our last minute or two, share your, thank you so much. I'm seeing hopeful allyship, connecting, learn, kind of what's on your mind right now. And again, in our short time together, this is just intended to be sort of to get you thinking and give you some direction and how you might continue your learning, connecting with some ideas, connecting with people in this network. You all are a powerful network for, leadership and potential change. So it's really exciting to think about, how you all might be able to take on the work of racial equity and inclusion as it intersects with conservation and land and water. Just really excited to think about the possibilities.
Great. I'm seeing allyship, connecting, learn, hopeful. Thank you so much, everyone, for gratitude. Yeah, that's great. So I just put the link again for the Google form. And then I know, Matt, you wanted to say a few words before we transition into break. So I don't know if this is a good time while people are still typing in some last thoughts. I'm going to put also our link to our website in here as well. And you can also on social media. We're on Facebook and we are on Twitter and Instagram.
Yeah, thank you, Jordan and Ananda. Thank you very much. I know as we talked about when we reached out to Jordan and Ananda to initiate this discussion, I'm going to try to imagine what you both thought, thinking we have 50 minutes to talk about this, and acknowledge that this is a scratching of the surface and this is a huge conversation. And we plan on actually continuing this conversation beyond this as an organization. So I wanted people to know that. I also wanted to give Jordan and Ananda a round of virtual applause for their presentation and thank them for participating and thank all of you for participating. So now we have, we're at the end of the session. We have a 5-minute break, not a 10-minute break, but a 5-minute break before we move into our first breakout sessions, which are going to begin promptly at 8:55. So those sessions are in this room. If you're interested in an update on DNR's targeted performance standard, you can remain right where you are and we'll get going on that in 5 minutes. The other session is adapting to the challenges of an all hands on deck crisis, which will be starting in room B. If you're interested in this session, have a look in the chat box. I think Christina just posted the virtual agenda at a glance, and just navigate to that session, click the join session link at the left, and away we go. So thanks again to Ananda and Jordan. Thank you all for joining our county conservation meeting. Have a wonderful summer, stay safe, and enjoy the rest of the sessions today.